You surface from the underground at Piccadilly Circus,
Mind the gap.
making your way through the glittering lights of London's West End. You take a turn down a quaint-looking street into the notorious neighborhood of Soho. The lights are dimming, the crowd is buzzing, and you've just tuned in to the best seat in the house. Welcome to The Big Smoke, a variety show podcast. I'm Kevin Bennett, and I'll be your guide through this experience of comedy, conversation, and community. Today, we're stepping into the strange and smoky world of alchemy, where fire is sacred, emperors search for immortality, and one man's golden urine just might shape the story of modern chemistry. First up, I sit down with author and adventurer Kit Chapman to discuss his new book, The Age of Alchemy, How Early Innovators Shaped Modern Chemistry. We travel the globe to uncover the remarkable people, ideas, and obsessions that transformed our understanding of the world. Then we pop into the local for a quick pub quiz. This round, Elemental Excellence. We're also trying something new, bringing you episodes every week. So stay tuned next Thursday for more adventurous audio, including mischievous folklore from the north of England and another remarkable mudlarking discovery from the banks of the Thames. But for now, let's tune in. Conversation. Kit Chapman is an award-winning journalist, adventurer, and author of The Age of Alchemy. With a PhD in the history of science, his work exploring the strange stories behind science has taken him to more than 100 countries, writing for publications including Nature, New Scientist, and the Daily Telegraph. So, let's light the Bunsen burners and say hello to Kit. Okay, here we are. Kit Chapman, thank you so much for being here on The Big Smoke.
No, thank you for having me.
I've really enjoyed digging into your book. I'm about halfway through. There's some fantastic stories. I want to hear, I think before we really dive into the specifics, can you give us the overall kind of premise of the book and how you came to writing it?
So one of the big things we have with chemistry is everyone thinks it begins in the 18th century. French Revolution, and then we suddenly get the Industrial Revolution and we have chemistry. But of course, that isn't the true story. Chemistry has been around since before humans were humans, when we were using fire, when we were creating leatherwork, for instance, when we were moving into metallurgy to build civilizations. And so I wanted to look at all of the various ways that chemistry entwined together. And it's more the story of humanity. It's not just about science. It's bringing in culture, philosophy, religion, and cultures from across the world. It's not just white Europeans in wigs. It's people from Africa. It's people from China, Sri Lanka, the Americas, all bringing their knowledge together and driving us forward.
Now, what made you, so I've read a little bit about you and you have a degree in pharmacy. Is that the genesis for writing this? I mean, one of the things that I love about the book that I think makes it really engaging to read is you're taking us on this adventure around the world. And correct me if I'm wrong, part of that was you literally were traveling to these places.
Yeah, I've literally been to all of those places. So when I write about a place in the book, I have been there.
So you, in the beginning of each section, you kind of paint the picture of where you are and you set the scene and all this stuff, and it's really, really engaging. I guess, how did you get from, when I think of a degree in pharmacy, I don't imagine world traveler, adventure explorer writing a book as exciting as this. How do you get from, that sort of degree in pharmacy to this? How does that come about?
I think it begins before the degree in pharmacy. So I was raised, my dad was in the Navy, and so my dad was often away at sea. And I was raised by a single parent mom who was passionate about storytelling. She would sit down and create stories with us. We didn't have a lot of money. And so she would create stories about Vikings and get us involved. And we were telling these tales. And I kind of got this wonderful visual image of the world that I wanted to see. So as soon as I started having any kind of money at all, really, and sometimes when I didn't, when I was at university and I was scrounging, I was always trying to travel and see a new place and kind of get a new perspective on things. And when I did pharmacy, I finished the degree. I went to work in Tesco, And for 6 months, I ticked boxes and I never left this little booth in Tesco. And behind they had the music aisle and they played Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses every 5 minutes. And I slowly drove myself insane. I just thought, that's not how I want to live. I want to go and see places and be that kind of person that brings information to others. So I moved into journalism. And I was lucky enough that I got a couple of jobs on science magazines where I could travel around the world, see new perspectives. And I just fell in love with finding new places. I haven't stopped since. I've now been to, I've just come back from Karakol, Pakistan, in Uzbekistan, and Mongolia. So that's 104 countries I've now been to.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So for the travel, specifically for the book, because I want to kind of use this as a way to dive into some of the fantastic stories that you have in it. How did you go about this? Did you plan the whole thing? Were you kind of making it up as you go along? And what were some of the surprises with places that you went to in order to research the stories for the book?
I kind of slumdog millionaire my way through life.
Okay.
In that sort of, I know things because they happen to me, or I meet someone who's fascinating and I want to know more about it. And also I'm one of those people that goes onto Wikipedia and I'm sort of locked for the next 4 hours going down these weird little routes. And so I just keep all of that in the memory bank and I just think, okay, how can I explore the world of chemistry using those little stories? What connects? So I'll admit I did a little mind map that sort of went all over a whiteboard, sort of zigzagging. And I was just thinking, how can I line this up? How can I tell a story? And set off to a couple of places. But it was the places that I didn't even think I was going to visit that really sort of entranced me. When I went to Tikal in Guatemala, for example, and I didn't know what that was going to be like. I didn't know what a Mayan ruin was going to be like. So you get at Guatemala City, you get a single line of seats on the plane. There's nothing else, fly out to Flores. And then you drive through the jungle for an hour and you get to somewhere where howler monkeys are screaming at night and they are loud. Also, they love throwing poo at people. So you've got to be really kind of careful. So 8 a.m. in the morning, I hike through the jungle to go to Tikal. And fortunately, I am the only person there. And I find myself
no guide or anything?
No. So there were a couple of people offering, but I went on my own. And no other tourists, the tourist buses hadn't sort of come in yet. So I was on my own in a Mayan city. You're allowed to climb on the ruins in Tikal. And I'm just bewildered by this place. I mean, entranced. It feels like I've discovered this lost city forever. How can you not write about that? And how can you not get excited when you realize that the reason these huge temples are still there is all because of chemistry. It's because of science. They built them using what's called pozzolan materials from volcanoes. And so they're self-repairing concrete. So even in the humid jungles of Guatemala, this city's been abandoned for 1,300 years. The concrete is self-repairing. You can climb on them, no problem at all.
So when you say self-repairing concrete, what do you mean? It's the specific ingredients in this concrete, and how does that work?
So usually when we have mortar, it's made out of calcium hydroxide, slaked lime. Okay. And that's fantastic, but you get some water in there, it's going to wash away. The concrete that they use is using aluminosilicates, calcium aluminosilicates. So when it gets wet, you're exposing the aluminium. Sorry, almost said aluminum then.
That's okay. Aluminum makes more sense to me, but aluminium to our British listeners.
Kicked out of the rules of chemistry. Aluminium and silicon. So you start getting these little shards. Yeah. And these shards essentially knit together and create blocks that repair the concrete. And so this is a fantastic technology. We use it in lighthouses. The Bell Rock Lighthouse off the coast of Scotland uses exactly the same thing. That's been going now for over 200 years. It has never needed a single repair.
Now, is there any evidence that the Mayans who were building at the time did this on purpose, or is it a stroke of incredible luck? What do
you don't do that by accident.
No.
So the Mayans at the time didn't realize exactly what was going on a chemical level. But they realized that it worked. And that was the key thing. So they started using that for water filtration as well. They had safe drinking water because they were running it through essentially a series of pores that were just cleaning and getting rid of the particles, filters. And as soon as something works and they start repeating it, it has to be by design. The Romans did exactly the same thing.
Wow. Now, okay, so when you're doing this, I'm just so curious about because I think this sounds like the most fun way to write a book. It's like, so what are you doing? Are you is visiting, for example, that site specifically more about getting a sense of the atmosphere and the story so that you can then really paint the picture when you're writing it? Or are you then speaking to people or doing tests or things, while you're there or both of them kind of thing?
It's a combination. So if there is someone who has, I have to recognize that I do not have the expertise in everything.
Sure.
You can't cover 3,000 years of history and be an expert in every single 10 years.
Of course.
So I will always defer to the experts. And quite often the experts are the people on the ground. They are not someone who's shut away in a sort of a cloistered university. So I'm talking to people all the time. I'm actually witnessing what's going on. They're explaining it to me so I can understand it. And the key thing with science is recognizing that what you're doing is you're talking in a different language. It's the same as speaking in French or speaking in Spanish. What you want to do is you want to translate that complicated science into English. And as soon as you do that, it makes it far more accessible for everybody else. The easiest way for me to do that is if I can witness the science myself and then translate it.
Well, it's been translated really in a really engaging way, I have to say. So the book is called The Age of Alchemy, subtitle, How Early Innovators Shaped Modern Chemistry. So we've got the word alchemy and we've got the word chemistry. Can you talk us through the evolution of sort of alchemy and how it becomes chemistry and the story of that? You do say in the book on page 109, chemistry is really the story of human history, which that was one of the things that really struck me in what I've read so far is I thought, wow, I didn't realize that chemistry is the story of just life and humanity. So tell us a bit about that evolution, alchemy, chemistry, how those two are related to each other.
The earliest mention we have of anything that can be described as chemistry, I mean, there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of the basic toolkit of chemistry, things like evaporation, filtration, boiling points, melting points. They were known by the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Egyptians. The origin of the word is chimia, and it first emerges in Roman-occupied Egypt. So this is shortly after famous Queen Cleopatra. We're talking about 50 AD, Emperor Nero is on the throne. And at this point, we get a combination of Greek philosophy, ancient Egyptian god worship, deities, decorations, artisan work, Jewish science, glass blowing comes from Judaism and Jewish expertise. All of this intermingles in Alexandria. In terms of where the word comes from, we don't know. It could be part of the ancient word for Egypt. It could be the blackening because things would char. It could be a Greek word for fusion. There's several different possible etymologies. But what we do know is the Emperor Diocletian in around 300 AD decides to get rid of this. So the alchemists at the time, or what would become or chymists, whatever you want to call them, they are creating gold or the appearance of gold as part of a tradition of artisanal skill. If you could make something look golden, it was golden to them, and their gods were made partly of gold. So you were able to commune with the gods. This was misinterpreted as a danger by the Roman Empire, because if you can make gold, then you can make gold coins. And of course, if your empire is fragile and you suddenly have a lot of money, you can pay to have the emperor killed. And he had 25 of his predecessors die in very, very short succession through assassinations and through all kinds of murkiness. So he gets rid of alchemy. He decides just to ban it. And that means there's very few original works that sort of survive. The only one we really have is the Leiden Papyrus X, which was actually buried, and it was dug up in the 1820s by a grave robber and sold to a collector. So we suddenly have this kind of mystique appearing. And it gets translated into Islamic science. The Islamic scientists add the al, because that means the. So the chemia becomes alchemia. And from there, it gets translated in the 12th century by a guy called Robert of Chester. He's working in Spain. He translates it into alchemy. And so that's how it moves into the Western world.
I was just thinking about the interesting little factoid of al meaning the, and in the book The Alchemist, I guess it's like the chemist, technically. Now, ancient Egypt isn't the oldest part of the book. You really start with fire. Tell me, why does the book start with fire? Why was that an important place to start?
It is the one chemical reaction that everybody knows. Everyone understands exactly that fire is some sort of chemical process. The wonderful thing about it is that while it is the first chemical process that we probably conquered, the one that sort of unlocks everything, the key to being able to create metals, for instance, from ore, you need fire. Any kind of thing with heat and the control of heat, you need fire. We still don't really know what fire is. If you ask someone to describe it, is it a solid, a liquid, or a gas? It's none of those things. Is it a plasma? No, it can cause plasmas. Are objects that are on fire burning? Many of them aren't, because it's actually it creates the vapor, and the vapor is the part that's burning. A candle never actually burns, which is just this sort of thing that almost seems counterintuitive. So we're enthralled by it. And it's so critical and central to everything that comes later. If there are two sort of things that you can define alchemy as understanding or trying to understand, one is fire, and that goes right up into the French Revolution. They had this idea that there was a substance called phlogiston, and phlogiston made things burn, and that we unlock that by proving what oxygen actually is. That's when we become chemistry. And the other thing is urine. Alchemists obsessed with urine.
Okay, so this is actually perfectly leading into my next question, which is I was like, I got to make sure we get to urine as quickly as possible because, I mean, as I said, I've only managed to read the first half of the book, but it's already coming in quite a lot right from the beginning.
Yep.
And then what I want to do is I want you to tell us, tease a little bit of this chapter that I'm really excited to read, which is titled "The Man with the Golden Urine."
Hennig
Can you
Brand.
tell us a bit about him and that chapter and why that's a part of the book? And then also more broadly, why urine seems to feature so heavily in the book.
I was tempted to call that taking the piss, but I thought that was probably a step too far. So urine was incredibly useful right from the off in terms of human society because, one, we all have it in abundance, but urea breaks down, we get ammonia.
Okay.
Ammonia is fabulous. It's a bleaching agent. It's an incredibly important base. Think about acids and bases. It's an alkaline substance. And so people were using that in laundries, for example, to make white cloths. You used to pee on robes to make them white. And it was so valuable that one of the Roman emperors, Vespasian, actually put a tax on draining urinals. And this tax on draining urinals funded the Colosseum.
That is crazy. I read that bit in the book and I thought, wow, if I don't think they include that in the tour. I think maybe it takes away from the grandness of it, or maybe I'm not remembering it when I went there, but that's a pretty incredible fact about that place.
Fantastic statement. Money doesn't stink.
Yeah.
Was his kind of view. So incredibly important, but it was used in all kinds of alchemical recipes. And one of the oldest, again, the Leiden Papyrus X, there's this mention of the urine of a small child. For creating this golden dip dye, essentially. He was sort of staining things. When we get to 1669, we get to a guy called Hennig Brand. He was a very strange chap. He bankrupted 2 wives with his quest to turn his own urine into gold. So they were funding his urine fermentation habits. He had, I think it's 1,700 liters of urine in his basement.
Own urine?
Yeah, well,
or
to be honest with you, I mean, he would have to be going quite a rate to produce that. I imagine it's someone else's as well.
But hang on, before you get into that, maybe you're about, sorry to interrupt you, but I was just thinking, what made him think that this was the thing?
Oh, so he had a book, as you do. And the thing with alchemy books is that they are incredibly coded. They use what's called decknamen. So they would replace words with sort of code words, if you like. And they could be things like, sailor's feces. That might actually mean a plant. Or bull's blood. Or take the sun in its height. And
meaning something completely different.
Meaning something completely different.
Okay.
So you could say, take Saturn. And what you mean by Saturn is lead. So the planet Saturn was associated with lead.
Okay.
The planet Mercury was associated with quicksilver.
And is this so that people couldn't copy the recipes or things like that, or was there a reason for them substituting?
So part of it is so people couldn't follow what's going on. You had to have knowledge to follow what's going on. It's sort of like an insider kind of thing. You had to be able to understand the recipe to actually do the recipe. But also it's a cop-out, because if you can't get the recipe to work, then it's just because you don't understand it well enough, right? And of course, lead into gold, it's never going to work.
Sure.
So you want to have that layer. Later on, they start playing around with, they start having a bit of fun. So there's someone called Mayan, and in the 17th century, Mayan writes a musical book that is a description of a Greek myth called Atalanta fleeing. So Atalanta was a huntress. She said that she would not marry anyone unless they could beat her in a foot race. Along comes this chap. He gets some golden apples from a goddess. Every time she overtakes him, he lobs a golden apple at her head. that distracts her, unsurprisingly. He's able to win, but he forgets to thank the goddess. And so they make both him and Atalanta very, very horny, and they have sex in a temple, and they turn into lions. That's the story.
Okay.
And Mayer takes this story. He uses one of them as mercury, one of them as sulfur, which is the idea. The idea at the time was that mercury and sulfur made up everything in the world. It was just a combination of different levels of it. And he uses this story as the basis for a guide of how to make gold. But he also uses pictures that seem to make no sense. There is a pregnant east wind. There is someone slaying a dragon. There is someone tapping an egg. Really weird stories and drawings. And he sets it all to music as well. Now, you've got the code words for sulfur and mercury in there. You've got the images which need to be translated because they're actually the chemical processes. You also need to translate the images into the correct order by using a magic square pattern. Okay. So there's a code and a code and a code and a code and a code. They're having fun. And it sort of distances yourself from it. And so you get this guy, Hennig Brand, coming along. And he's reading his book. He is confident that urine must be the secret to making
Somehow
gold.
he's, quote unquote, cracked the code and figured out that to him it's urine.
Exactly.
Is what it is. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you know those sort
Maybe
of big,
misinterpreted it. I don't know.
yeah, you know those big sort of treasure hunts where everyone's kind of got the different interpretation of where the
totally.
gold is buried and all that kind of
Yes,
stuff.
or an escape room or something like that.
So
We've got the puzzle.
he thinks the answer to the puzzle is urine.
Okay.
And so he slaves and he slaves and he slaves, and suddenly his urine begins to glow. And he thinks he has cracked the code.
Obviously from him eating something or drinking something.
No. Your urine glows and my urine glows if you do the
okay.
right processes.
Oh, mixing it, with something.
Yeah, he's
Okay.
heating it up, condensing it, boiling it, doing a whole.
Just wondering what I should do later tonight to try to figure this out.
So what he was actually doing was he was extracting phosphorus, of which there is a tiny, tiny amount of phosphorus in our urine.
Okay.
Just from our bodies. And but he didn't realize that. So he got this glowing substance. He thought he had made the philosopher's stone, the thing that would make gold. Wouldn't tell anyone. You know, he kept this a secret for years until he sold the recipe for the equivalent of about £100,000.
Wow.
Yeah. And the guy he sold it to was a bit entrepreneurial. He thought rather than sort of keep it to himself, he was going to make the phosphorus show, he called it.
Oh my God.
Where he would show his glowing urine to the crown heads of Europe. And this guy toured around Europe showing people his glowing pee-pee.
No. Now, hang on. Before we get to this, you said that Hennig Brand, so he'd gone bankrupt trying to do this.
He had bankrupted 2 wives doing this.
Trying to fund this.
Yeah, trying to fund his urine
but then
habit.
he ended up making a lot of money.
Yeah, sold it to this guy. Yeah.
So he did okay in the end.
He came out okay.
Sold the recipe to this guy. Okay, so now we've got the wee show.
Yeah.
How does that go over?
Fantastically. I mean, it is the wonder of the age.
Oh my gosh. When is this again? Take me to the time.
So this is
place.
the 1600s.
Okay, 1600s
So yeah, you're looking
and whereabouts?
1669 in Germany, traveling around.
Okay, I'm here.
You're judging. That's a judgy face.
No, I'm just there. I'm just trying to take myself there. Okay, interesting.
It gets moved to London, and one of the people that witnesses this urine show is a guy called Robert Boyle. Now, Robert Boyle is fantastically wealthy.
Okay.
He is the son of the Earl of Cork, and huge patron of science, also a scientist himself, founds the Royal Society. He's kind of friends with Robert Hooke. He knows Isaac Newton, all these sort of luminaries. Very strange guy in his own right. He was terrified of making oaths because one time he got scared during a storm. And he swore to God that if God spared him and he didn't die from lightning, then he would dedicate his life to science. Okay. And he sort of felt he was locked in at that point.
Yeah.
Anyway, Robert Boyle immediately realizes that something else is going on here, and he realizes that it's phosphorus, the first element that we actually know has been created, and it was discovered, by a named person, something not from antiquity. And so it unlocks this whole mystery. It starts unraveling the mystery of what our world is made from. But it's all because this guy was trying to make gold from his own wee.
Do we know where in London the show was? I'm just curious.
I
Where
imagine
they
it's
did-
probably recorded somewhere. I would imagine
Yeah.
central London because, as I say, Robert Boyle was founding the Royal Society. He was well known
Okay.
in sort of central London. Royal Society's on the Mall, so you know.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. What a story. Oh my gosh. Well, you get more details of that in the book, so definitely recommend it. If for nothing else, then for that. Another section that I was that really enjoyed, and I thought was you painted the picture in a really lovely way. You talk about a formative chemical lesson for yourself that you discovered at the, speaking of London locations, at the John Soane's Museum in London. Can you take us there and what was it that you discovered?
Sure. So John Soane's Museum in London, for those who haven't been, is for me one of the hidden treasures in terms of museums. It looks like a normal townhouse, and you step inside and this guy outbid the British Museum regularly. He has a collection of Hogarths that are sort of spinning around on the walls. He's got the death mask of Oliver Cromwell's in there. Just this fabulous collection of antiquities. He was an architect. He designed the Bank of England. That was his kind of claim to fame. And he was obsessed with the sarcophagus of Seti I. So this was a tomb discovered in Egypt by a guy called the Great Belzoni, who was a strong...
Like a wrestler or something
Yeah,
like
he was
that?
a strongman.
A strongman.
He was a strongman, a circus strongman.
How did he discover it? That's what I want to know.
A circus strongman called the Great Belzoni decided to
a great
move into
name.
archaeology, as you do.
As you do. What a great name, too.
And rather than sort of preserve the tombs, just started ripping bits off the wall and sort of bringing that everywhere.
He was the strong man.
Yeah. And so there was a sarcophagus. It was an alabaster sarcophagus, and it was almost translucent. Absolutely beautiful work of art, inlaid with this rich color called Egyptian blue. And Egyptian blue is the first pigment that we actually created. You can't find it in nature. It's essentially glass with a little bit of copper tint in it. Really, really sort of gorgeous, deep blue. And obviously, John Soane wanted this, in so much so that he actually had the wall of his house removed to bring in the sarcophagus. And if you go to the John Soane's Museum, it is the centerpiece. Everything leans down to the sarcophagus, which now kind of looks a bit sort of reddy and ruddy and beigey and browny. And that's because it's the atmosphere of London. You know, we are in a damp climate. You know, even if you ignore the sort of pollution that was going around at the time in, early industrial revolution, we are just not the climate that is going to preserve an alabaster coffin inlaid with this wonderful material, which is unfortunately going to be absorbing water. So the inlay is gone, and the color, that white translucence, has gone. It is now this kind of brown color. And for me, that was a lesson not only in the fact that chemistry is very much site specific, and that's one of the reasons that we haven't dug into the tomb of the emperor in Terracotta Warriors. We think we know where the emperor's buried, but we don't know if we can preserve all the stuff in there. Just at this moment, we don't have the technology. So we've started to sort of reapproach archaeology, but more importantly, it sort of paid to the myth that we can preserve things better than other countries. It's just not true. Here is evidence that moving it to the UK actually probably damaged this incredibly beautiful, priceless artifact.
Now, tell me a bit about, so we're talking about the Egyptian blue. I was really interested in this chapter about the ideas around how Egyptian painting was a way to commune with the gods.
Yeah.
What was the story of that?
So the Egyptians believed that their gods, their deities, could be spoken to directly. And if you had an idol, you weren't talking to an idol of that god, you were talking to the god themselves. And that didn't have to be a direct replica. You didn't have to use gold and silver and lapis lazuli, which was particularly important to the Egyptians. You could use the colors. And so they started thinking of ways to create essentially fake gold, fake silver, fake lapis lazuli. We get the pigment Egyptian blue. And we get these techniques that become chemia. So when I spoke about it earlier being part of this artisanal tradition of ancient Egypt, they didn't see a difference between the fake gold and gold. They didn't understand at a chemical level that's a different thing, that one's an element, one's not. They didn't see that as being a way of knocking down its value. They saw it as a really important way to talk to their deities. And only by appreciating the cultural significance of an artifact or an object at that time to those people, can we really appreciate how chemistry evolved. It's very easy to say alchemy was a dead end and it went in the wrong direction. I don't think it did. I think that it was a key part of civilization evolving and thinking about the world. And we wouldn't have got to chemistry if it wasn't for alchemy.
Now, communing with the gods, but also at one point you mentioned that Egyptian blue or Egyptian paint is connected to unlocking your car door. So tell me, how do we get from that? How do we get from, what's the link of how it also might be a part of that?
It's fantastic for telecommunications. So we're starting to use Egyptian blue because, as I mentioned, all it is essentially is glass and a bit of copper in there. We're looking at things on the near infrared spectrum. So when we look at the world around us, we are only looking at a tiny, tiny part of the spectrum of all wavelengths. Just slightly off there, we can start using Egyptian blue. Incredibly useful for telecommunications, or if you want a more practical use for us, opening your car door.
In your travels, I don't know, sometimes I think, because I love the idea, going back to the beginning of this conversation, of the sort of adventure that you had to go on and not being sure of all the twists and turns of what's going to happen in each place. Was there anything that you kind of got into trouble, or not got into trouble, but a little bit of this is not what I expected this to be. I got to make a quick right turn, or situations that you didn't want to be in, or that weren't the way that you thought they were going to be?
All the time. I mean, whenever I travel, there's always some things that get thrown up. I have been held at gunpoint, for example.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, by the Russian
military. In relation
military.
to the book?
So this was an earlier book that I was working on, and I was trying to get into. I was getting into a Russian military base, as you do.
Yeah.
And and we had passes, and this was in Dubna, which is a very sort of traditional Soviet. If you imagine a Soviet town with the sort of the hammer and the sickle on the walls and all that kind of stuff, that's Dubna. And I was trying to get into this military base to talk to some nuclear scientists, as you do. I had the passes. We hadn't told them we were bringing in cameras. And the moment they saw the cameras, we had guns leveled at us. And this very small man with a very, very big hat came out and sort of was barking at us. And we kind of got hurried back to our hotel. And I think it's now safe for me to tell the rest of this story. I've held off for almost 10 years.
This is an exclusive.
This is an exclusive. So we got back to the hotel. We were sort of kicking around, and our guide said, "Look, it's fine. We've worked out a solution." I talked to the head of security, and he said, "You got to remember that my guards are idiots. What you need to do is you need to drive into the complex. Just put the cameras in the boot. They won't think to search." And so even though they'd seen us, so we smuggled these cameras in. God. We did our interviews, and then we smuggled them out. So yes, I have smuggled materials into a Russian military base.
I don't think we're massive in Russia yet, so you should be okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, back into the book. I was interested in, you briefly mentioned the Terracotta Warriors, which I'm fortunate enough in Xi'an to have visited myself just a year or two before COVID. And is that connected to, there's a chapter in the book that you talk about that's sort of Chinese emperors seeking immortality under a river of mercury. Is that linked to that story?
Completely linked to that story.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the first emperor of China, the Qin emperor, he believed in immortality through mercury. So Chinese alchemy is all about not just longevity, but immortality. And there are several different grades of immortality. The lowest is that you vanish overnight and leave your shoes, as you do. The second is the sort of the wandering immortal. So there's the 8 immortals, very, very famous in Chinese opera. And then the highest is, of course, you go and work in the celestial bureaucracy with the gods, because what is a better way to spend the rest of your life than working as a civil servant for a celestial emperor? And he very much believed in this. He thought that Mercury was the secret. And of course, if you look at Mercury as someone 2,000 years ago, why wouldn't it be? It's this strange metal that's liquid and it kind of pours and it's kind of wonderful. I remember as a kid watching Terminator 2, with the T-1000 and the Mercury sort of glooping together and reforming the sky, and just thinking, wow, that's so cool. So of course the Chinese were enamored with it. And he created the Terracotta Warriors, as you mentioned, Xi'an. We think that they are potentially one of 4 sets of Terracotta Warriors. There are sort of more that are buried around this giant tomb. And supposedly in his actual tomb, along with all sorts of booby traps and kind of wonders, there is this river of mercury that he's buried under to sort of preserve him. We don't know if that's true. It seems kind of implausible. He's also supposedly buried with the bodies of mermaids and things like that.
Okay.
As you do. But what we do know is that mound has a high level of mercury in the soil. And that could be from industrial pollution. It's entirely possible, but it probably hints that there is some sort of truth to that legend. And what we do know is that subsequent Chinese emperors, particularly in the Tang dynasty, there are at least 5 who die from mercury poisoning. They drink mercury elixirs to try and make sure that they live forever and end up killing themselves. And the guy who sells it to them, he gets executed. And then another guy comes along, offers it to the son, and he thinks, why not? I'll try mercury as well.
You learn from the first one, but I guess not.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, I don't know if this was in another interview or if it was a direct quote from the book, but, you mentioned somewhere that everything is chemistry. And I thought that's really interesting because I guess if you really think about it, everything is chemistry on some level. Can you give us an example of something that people who aren't scientists might not normally think of as being chemistry and how it is chemistry?
Well, you and I, for example, we are made up of trillions of cells with trillions of chemical reactions going on continuously. Anything you can see, anything you can touch is chemistry. Chemistry is the science of stuff. And it's all about how electrons move between stuff as sort of currency. And that's what chemical reactions are. So everything that exists that we can sort of feel. I mean, obviously physics is kind of controlling things like gravity and the forces around us, but even the air around us, this is chemistry. And in fact, understanding what's in the air, breaking that down, understanding what carbon dioxide was or hydrogen or nitrogen or oxygen, that's how we ended up getting to the point that we started thinking, what is the world made from? There's this guy called Antoine Lavoisier around the time of the French Revolution. In fact, he was killed during the French Revolution. And he comes up with the first ever list in his book, Elements of Chemistry, where he tries to list things that he can't simplify. And he doesn't get it completely right. He thinks that calories are chemistry. He thinks that they're elements. He thinks that light is an element. That's not. That's just photons. But that list is really the key stepping point to starting to think about what our world is made from. All those little building blocks, atoms and molecules and compounds. And it's then that we start getting to the really kind of juicy stuff. As soon as we make that breakthrough, the floodgates open. We get people like Humphrey Davy just coming up with all kinds of elements. He becomes the lead element discoverer right up until the middle of the 20th century when we start making elements using nuclear reactions. And we start to piece together what the world is actually doing. But we would never have got there if someone like Lavoisier wasn't trying to disprove this phlogiston theory that I mentioned by doing experiments with oxygen. It's only through that sort of iterative process of getting through untangling the mythology, untangling the cultural aspects that we actually reach science that becomes applicable to us in our everyday lives.
It's so interesting because one of the things that you mentioned with the book is, and we talked about right in the beginning, is sort of how alchemy becomes chemistry and framing the history of chemistry in a different way. There's a lot more women. There's a lot more diversity in terms of people who you could call chemists that maybe we wouldn't have traditionally or conventionally called them chemists. Was it difficult for you to convince people that this book was worth writing because it isn't the way that we look at chemistry, or did people find it kind of exciting from the pitch?
I think people found it really exciting, particularly my publisher, Izzy. She's absolute phenomenon, and she was just so excited that people were looking at things in a different way. And we spoke very briefly, and she said, "Look, I don't want you to write a history of chemistry that begins with the French Revolution. That's a story that's been done multiple times. What we need to do is start looking at it from a worldwide perspective." And that was something I was really happy to do, because when you look at chemistry, it initially began as a sort of an idea of the kind of lost queens of alchemy, this sort of idea of the mythos. But the more interesting story is when you strip away the mythos and you look at who those people really were and understand them from their own perspectives. People like Mary the Jewess and Cleopatra the alchemist, Thea Sabia, who may or may not have existed, Isabella Cortez, who wrote a book in the the Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, a book of secrets, The Secrets of Isabella Cortez, which is a combination of alchemy and sort of homebrew recipes. Isabella Cortez probably was a man. was probably a man pretending to be a woman so that he could sell books. As you start exploring these stories and you sort of putting them into their own cultural frameworks, for me, that becomes far more valuable as a storyteller, and it becomes far more valuable for an audience understanding where chemistry comes from, because it speaks to something incredibly human. And the more I read up on various aspects to write the book, the more I realized that it is the story of humanity. It isn't sort of this separate thing. You can't take science away from being a person alive at that time, trying to survive, trying to make money, trying to find a way for you to operate in that world. Science has always been political. Things like making steel in Sri Lanka, it dries up because Sri Lanka got invaded. And people no longer saw the value because traders weren't coming there. It speaks to everything that happens in our world. And that's part of why I absolutely love the history of science. You can't untangle it from the wider sphere.
Well, there were so many stories that illuminated that for me. For example, the story of the British essentially making China addicted to opium.
Oh yeah, we were drug dealers.
Their teeth
getting away from it.
First, first drug trade or whatever you want to call it. The way to manipulate a people in order to get what they wanted with their tea fix. But this actually is a nice way to kind of lead us to wrapping up. Speaking about, at one point in the book, you talk about, I'm not sure if this is the right pronunciation, but Taputi, I think.
Tafuti Belakhan,
Tafuti, like potentially the first kind of name that we can put to chemistry. Tell us a bit about her and why she was someone that you wanted to include in the book.
So it was really important to me to recognize that we needed to move out of Europe. We needed to look at the wider perspective, but we also need to recognize women in science because they've been there from the very start. And the first name that we can put to the science that will become chemistry is Tafuti Belakhan. She was a perfumer, and she was working in the royal palaces in what is now Iraq. It was Babylonia at the time, working in the city of Assur. And taking that work and sort of what she was doing was relatively straightforward processes. She was making perfumes, which is just steeping, and the techniques being used by her 3,000 years ago are the same techniques that you would recognize today in a general perfumers. But she signed her name. She put her name. This is the recipe by Tafuti Belakhan. And in fact, we know that someone else was working for her. Another woman was working with her. Unfortunately, the tablet's been damaged, and so we can't get her full name. And it struck me that this is the story of, there's a very famous passage in the Bible that your daughters will be taken to be perfume makers. Often perfume makers were slaves. So we have this name that is lingering through history of a slave girl, potentially, we don't know for certain, who was working making perfumes in a palace for a king. And I couldn't tell you the name of the king, but I can tell you the name of the person that was actually doing that work. Chemistry is a science of the underclasses. It is a science of steampunk. It is a science for everybody. And that's so important to share.
I love it. And we started this interview talking about your adventurous life traveling. We've even dipped into some crazy bits of travel that weren't connected to the book. What's next? You don't seem to stay in one place for too long. So where are you off to next, and what are you hoping to discover? Can you share anything about what you're looking into?
So
now?
I have just come back from the Republic of Karakorum, Pakistan, which is in western Uzbekistan, a place called Nukus. And from Nukus, you've then got to do 3 hours on a road that has absolutely nothing there. And I was looking at the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea was the third largest lake in the world 100 years ago. It no longer exists.
Wow.
The Soviets rerouted for irrigation. They were trying to make cotton. And so they rerouted the rivers that flowed into the sea. And so this area that once had ducks and geese and teeming with wildlife, and there were ships and there were storms on the Aral Sea. I mean, it was a deep lake. It is now an empty desert that has rusting fishing vessels 100 miles from the nearest coastline. It's an astonishing, eerie place. And the chemistry of the land, because you've now got things, instead of blowing over water, it's blowing over desert, kicking up dust storms. It's changing the chemistry of the soil. It's changing the genetics of the people. And so I've been looking at how to tell the story of these kind of forgotten places where we kind of messed things up a little bit, and we've actually changed the chemistry, the geology, and again, the culture and the society of places purely through a mistake.
Wow. Is this for a future book or just research at this point?
I think I can say that there is a book coming. So.
Yeah. Wow. Well, absolutely exciting. There's so much that we could talk about. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me.
After all that alchemical adventuring around the world, I'm feeling a little thirsty and curious to see how much you remember from science class. So let's pop into the local for a quick pub quiz. This round, Elemental Excellence. Question number 1. Which element was named after the Greek word meaning green-yellow? Is it A, copper, B, neon, C, bromine, or D, chlorine? Question number 2. Which element was once considered so valuable that Emperor Napoleon III reportedly reserved cutlery made from it for his most important dinner guests? Was it A, silver, B, platinum, C, aluminum, or aluminium as the Brits say, or D, titanium? And question number 3. Which element was first discovered by scientists studying the sun before it was ever found on Earth? Was it A, helium, B, neon, C, hydrogen, or D, radon? Think you're the winning Walter White? Head to the show notes and see how you scored. Well, that's today's episode. We've journeyed through the fiery world of alchemy, from ancient experiments and immortal ambitions to the strange beginnings of modern chemistry itself. If you'd like to help the Big Smoke keep bubbling away, why not share this episode with a friend? And next time you warm your hands by the fire or wait for the kettle to boil, remember, humanity has always come together to tell stories, seek answers, and transform the world around us, just as we do here in the Big Smoke.